The moment my boss decided to destroy my career was the same moment he unknowingly ended his own. My name is Olivia Carter, and 3 months ago, I stood in the center of a glass conference room while 30 coworkers watched my boss publicly fire me like I was some kind of warning example. It started during our Monday executive meeting, the kind where everyone pretends to care about quarterly reports while secretly checking emails under the table. I had just finished presenting the market expansion plan I had spent 6 weeks building when Richard Caldwell, our CEO, leaned back in his leather chair with that smug smile everyone in the company recognized. "Well," he said loudly, tapping the table with his pen, "that might be the most optimistic fantasy I've heard all year." A few nervous chuckles rippled around the room. My stomach tightened, but I stayed calm. Richard loved humiliating people. It was his favorite management strategy. I thought he'd just tear apart the presentation like usual. Instead, he closed the folder in front of him and looked around the table like he was about to deliver a show. "You know what the real problem is with this company?" he continued, raising his voice slightly. "People like Olivia here, who think enthusiasm can replace competence." The room went silent. My coworker Daniel stopped typing. The HR manager froze mid-sip of coffee. Richard stood up slowly, straightening his expensive suit like a politician about to make a speech. "I've tolerated mediocrity long enough," he said, pointing directly at me. "Olivia Carter, you're fired, effective immediately." For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. Fired? Just like that? No warning, no discussion, nothing? I felt 30 pairs of eyes turn toward me as whispers started around the table. Richard wasn't done yet. "Security will escort you out," he added loudly, making sure everyone heard. "Consider this a lesson in what happens when people overestimate their value." A wave of embarrassment flushed through me, but I didn't react the way he expected. Instead of arguing or crying, I simply picked up my notebook and closed it slowly. That seemed to irritate him even more. "Nothing to say?" he asked mockingly. I looked directly at him. "No," I replied calmly. "Not really." Around the room, my coworkers looked uncomfortable, some avoiding eye contact while others watched like they were witnessing a car crash. The door opened behind me, and one of the security guards stepped inside awkwardly, clearly unsure how aggressive he was supposed to be. Richard gestured toward the hallway like he was dismissing a waiter. "Let's keep the meeting moving," he said. "We've already wasted enough time." As I turned toward the door, I could hear the quiet murmurs starting behind me. Another employee fired. Another public humiliation. Richard loved reminding everyone who held the power. But what none of them knew was that this meeting wasn't the end of my story with this company. In fact, it was the exact moment everything was about to change, because 10 minutes from now, the board of directors was scheduled to walk through that same door, and Richard Caldwell was about to learn a truth that would turn this entire room upside down. I had just stepped into the hallway with the security guard trailing awkwardly behind me when the conference room door suddenly opened again and voices from inside spilled into the corridor, and for a second, I considered simply leaving the building and never looking back. But something made me pause near the reception desk because I knew something the rest of that room didn't yet understand. The guard beside me, a middle-aged guy named Frank, who I'd seen around the building for years, shifted uncomfortably and lowered his voice. "Look, I'm sorry about that," he said quietly. "Orders are orders." I gave him a small smile. "Don't worry, Frank. Just give it a minute." He frowned slightly, clearly confused, but before he could ask anything else, the elevator at the end of the hallway opened with a soft chime, and 3 members of the company's board of directors stepped out, followed by 2 lawyers carrying folders. I recognized them immediately. Margaret Whitmore, the chairwoman, along with board members Daniel Ruiz and Stephen Patel, people who almost never came to the office in person unless something serious was happening. Margaret spotted me first and raised her eyebrows. "Olivia?" she said, walking toward me. "Why are you standing out here?" Before I could answer, Richard's voice echoed from inside the conference room. "If everyone could focus, we still have—" The sentence cut off when the board members pushed the door open and walked inside without knocking. Frank and I stayed in the hallway, but the glass walls made everything visible. I watched Richard straighten immediately, his confident posture snapping back into place like a switch had been flipped. "Margaret," he said, forcing a smile, "we weren't expecting you until this afternoon." Margaret didn't return the smile. "Clearly," she replied calmly, glancing around the room at the uncomfortable employees. "We were told this would be a good time to address the staff." Richard nodded quickly, trying to regain control of the room. Of course, of course. Actually, we were just wrapping up a small personnel matter." One of the employees hesitated before speaking. "Sir, you just fired Olivia." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Yes, thank you. I'm aware of my own decisions." Through the glass wall, I saw Margaret's expression change slightly, like someone hearing a detail that suddenly made a puzzle make sense. She turned toward the door and looked straight at me in the hallway. "Olivia," she said clearly, "would you come back inside, please?" Frank looked at me, confused. Richard looked even more confused. I stepped back into the conference room slowly, while 30 stunned coworkers watched me walk past the chair I had been sitting in only minutes earlier. Richard crossed his arms. "Margaret, with all respect, Olivia Carter no longer works here." Margaret placed a thin folder on the conference table and folded her hands calmly. "That's actually the issue we need to discuss," she said. Richard let out a small laugh. "There's nothing to discuss. I'm the CEO. I decide who works here." The room stayed silent for a moment. Then Margaret opened the folder. "Richard," she said evenly, "the board completed the final vote this morning regarding the majority ownership transfer of Caldwell Technologies." Richard frowned slightly. "Ownership transfer?" Margaret looked directly at him. "Yes, the new majority owner of this company officially took control today." Richard glanced around the room, irritated. "And why exactly are we discussing that during my meeting?" Margaret slowly turned the folder toward the table and slid it in my direction. "Because," she said, "the new owner is standing right here." For a few seconds, the entire conference room went completely silent, the kind of silence so heavy you could almost feel it pressing against the walls, and every single person at the table slowly turned their head toward me as Margaret's words sank in. Richard blinked once, then twice, like he was waiting for someone to laugh and admit it was a joke. "I'm sorry," he said, finally, forcing a chuckle. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Margaret didn't respond to the joke. She simply tapped the folder she had slid across the table toward me. "There's no misunderstanding," she said calmly. "As of this morning, Olivia Carter holds the controlling shares of Caldwell Technologies. The transfer was finalized at 8:15 a.m. I opened the folder slowly, mostly for the sake of everyone watching, though I already knew exactly what was inside because I had spent the last 2 months in meetings with lawyers preparing for this moment. The documents were simple: ownership contracts, board approval signatures, and the official notice of leadership transition. Richard's smile disappeared. "That's impossible," he said sharply. "This company belongs to me." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "It belonged to your father," she corrected. "When he passed away last year, the estate began reviewing several private investments he had quietly accumulated over the past decade." A few employees leaned forward in their chairs, clearly trying to piece together what was happening. Richard's voice grew louder. "What does that have to do with her?" Margaret looked at me before answering. "Your father believed the company needed new leadership someday, someone who actually understood how the business worked from the ground level, so he began transferring shares into a trust controlled by a silent partner." Richard's face slowly drained of color as the realization crept in. I closed the folder gently and looked at him. "That silent partner," I said, keeping my voice calm, "was me." A ripple of whispers exploded around the room. Someone near the back muttered, "Wait, what?" Richard slammed his hand against the table. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She's a junior analyst." Margaret shook her head. "She was a junior analyst," she corrected, "until about 10 minutes ago." The room erupted into stunned murmurs while Richard looked like the ground had just vanished beneath his feet. I stepped forward slightly, resting my hands on the conference table where he had been sitting like a king only minutes earlier. "You were right about one thing, Richard," I said quietly. "This company does have a problem with leadership." He stared at me, speechless now. Around the table, the same employees who had watched him fire me were now watching something even more unbelievable unfold. Margaret cleared her throat gently. "Given the circumstances," she announced, "the board believes it would be appropriate for the new owner to address the company." I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people who had worked beside me for years, people who had just seen me escorted out by security. Then I turned back to Richard. "Earlier," I said, calmly, "you told everyone that people shouldn't overestimate their value." I paused, letting the moment hang in the air. "So let me correct one small mistake." The room was silent again. "You're fired."